Welcome to Morrisson-Reeves Library's Green Thumb Thursday program. Tonight's program is Soils, Worms, and Plants, Oh My. It's about composting and enriching your soil, a very important part of giving nutrients to the plants that need to grow. We're so happy that you joined us in our hybrid workshop. We are very lucky to have Stephanie McCurdy as our presenter. She has been doing outdoor and environmental education for decades about making our soil the delicious food that our plants need to grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. I'm happy to be here. As she said, I'm with the Cope Environmental Center. Are you guys familiar with the Cope Center? Somewhere, yeah. It's between Centerville and Richmond on Airport Road. We have 140 acres, and it's a natural resource facility that promotes the wise use of the Earth's natural resources through education, demonstration, and research. So a lot of what we do there is field trips for school groups and going into schools and educating. And as you well know, this past year has been a challenge for all of us. And so I'm pretty excited to be here because this is one of the first programs I've been able to do this year. We do, this time of year, we do start a lot of plants and start our vegetable gardens. We have some demonstration gardens where we grow food for ourselves and for volunteers and for really anybody in the community. We've donated a lot of the food that we grow from our gardens. So Jim and Helen Cope started the Cope Environmental Center back in 1992, and they had a huge garden that they fed their family of 5 from when they started their family in the 1940s. Has anybody seen their raised beds in their gardening out there? Helen Cope, when I first started at the Cope Environmental Center, way back in 1996. I left 5, I haven't been there that long. I worked there for 2.5 years, and then I had some kids and stayed home for 7 years, and then worked at the Arboretum for 16 years, and then I'm back at the Cope Center now. But when I first started working there the first time, Helen and Jim still lived in the house on the Cope Center property. And Helen got up every morning, and she collected the eggs from the chickens, and then she worked in her garden for 3 hours. And so much of what I learned those first few years at the Cope Center from Jim and Helen was about gardening and about composting and taking care of the soil that we use every day. So I'm guessing since all of you are here, you have a level of gardening love that you are going to utilize this summer, right? How many of you are growing vegetables? Very good. How many of you are just growing flowers? Growing both, which is me. So our soil is the beginning of what we have to do to grow any plant at all, whether it's a vegetable or a flower or fruit. And we have to take care of our soil because we know that our plants suck up the nutrients from the soil up into the plant to produce the flower or the fruit. So to start with that, we have to keep our soil healthy with amendments. So how many of you guys have heard just get some horse manure, put it out there on there, and the horse manure will do the trick, which is what we're always told. And horse manure will do the trick, but if you take the horse manure straight from the barn and put it on your garden without letting it sit for a year or two, it has way too much nitrogen, uric acid, those kind of things, and it burns your plants. And plus, if you don't let it sit for a couple of years, you also get all of the weeds that the horse has digested that comes out in the manure, so you get a lot of weeds too. So you have to actually let your manure sit for a couple of years before you can use it on your plants. Composting is the way to utilize the things that we already produce in our homes or in our yards, and kind of takes out the whole need to have a horse to make our soil much richer.
Right?
I grew up with 5 horses, so that was like, oh, I really want the horse. But now that I live in town, I try to decide whether I can put a miniature horse in the backyard to make it work. I don't know. Would the neighbors object?
It's just a pony.
It's just a little pony. So what is composting? Composting is the process of recycling organic materials such as leaves and grasses and vegetable scraps into rich organic amendment that you can mix into your soil. We call it black gold. If you're a gardener, we can call that black gold. I meant to grab a jar of compost from the Cope Center today, but kind of missed that on my way out the door. But I have with me the worm composter. We're going to talk about worm composting here in a little bit. But you guys can see right here, this top layer here is black compost that's already in here. So when we think about the compost that we create in our compost piles or in our worm compost, it's typically a very dark black colored soil. And it's rich in the nutrients because it's totally just nature's way of recycling. So the benefits of compost is that when we mix our compost in with our regular soil, I have raised beds in my backyard. So this spring, before I plant anything in there, I will turn my soil and I will mix the compost from my compost pile straight into my soil. So you can use a rototiller for that, or if you just have an old-fashioned pitchfork or rake, you can just rake it up, loosen the soil, and then sprinkle your compost. I usually do about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of compost on top and mix it in with the soil. Let it sit overnight and then plant my plants the next day. And that compost in the soil will enhance the plant's natural ability to stand up to common diseases. So it's kind of like that whole idea that, as a parent, I was a little bit of a hippie. So my kids would wreck their bike and they would come in with their big bloody knee and I'd just tell them to rub some dirt in it and get over it, we'll wash it out later. And they don't get sick very much. But the whole idea of if you have the compost in there, it helps them build the plant's immune system and keeps them a little less susceptible to diseases. Let me put a caveat to that though. If you take a bunch of weeds that are affected by a fungus or some sort of wilt and you put it in your compost pile, like if you put your diseased stuff in the compost pile, you're going to get compost that's diseased coming out of it. So always make sure that whatever you're composting does not have brown spots that are disease related. If it's like a dehydration issue, that's one thing, but if it's clearly a disease or a fungus, don't put that in your compost pile. Also, if you don't want dandelions in your raised bed, don't put your dandelions in your compost pile either. So don't compost your weeds. When we use a lot of compost, it helps maintain soil. Compost maintain moisture. Compost is kind of like nature's sponge a little bit. When we think about looking at an area where there's been a lot of erosion, typically you see bigger chunks like rocks and bigger chunks of soil that hasn't been able to absorb water. So compost kind of gets rid of that, the process of decomposition, gets rid of that compaction that happens that prevents the soil from being able to absorb the water. When we compost, we can reduce our household trash because most of the things that we are going to be composting are going to be leaves from the yard. You can compost sticks and twigs. You can compost, like if you trim your shrubs, you can put those in your compost. Newspaper and nothing that's shiny, but like some of your mail that comes in, you can shred it up and compost it as well. Cardboard, as long as you shred it into small pieces, you can compost it in your compost pile. And then all of your fruit and vegetable scraps. So in my house, we just say it, no meat, no cheese, no dairy. So eggshells can go in the compost, but don't put your cheese in there, don't put your chicken bones in there. And the reason for that is it smells, number one, and number two, if you don't want raccoons fighting over chicken bones at 2 in the morning and scaring the crap out of you, don't put them in the compost pile. And then compost, because it is so rich in nutrients, enhances the flavor of fruits and vegetables, and arguably can enhance nutrition as well. They will grow, if you incorporate it the right amount of compost, it will act as a fertilizer and you'll be able to grow bigger fruits and vegetables. And I'm guessing bigger flowers too. All right, so what is the soil food web? And this is really what compost is building. And when we think about our food webs in nature, we talk about this a lot at the Cope Center. We have, the mouse that eats grasses, and then you have the birds of prey that eat the mouse. So we have this whole complex food web that happens above ground. But there's also an additional complex food web that happens below ground. So, I know, it's pretty deep to think about. So we have all this microscopic bacteria and funguses that are under the ground. So when you think about, how many of you guys like going morel hunting, mushroom hunting? Anybody? Yeah.
I like eating them.
I love eating them too. But mushrooms themselves are the fruiting body. It's like, think of it as the flower to all this fungus that's going on underground. So for the entire year, this fungus is down there just spreading its mycorrhizae under there. And then for just a few weeks out of the year, the morels send up that mushroom, and the whole job is to release the spores to reproduce, to create more mushrooms. But the fungus itself has been living under the ground and continues to live for the whole entire year. And that's just one of the mushrooms. So if you go and look at it, walk through the forest, you see all kinds of different types of funguses, or fungi. And this fungi's job is a decomposer to turn everything back into soil. So when we think about how we have this whole class of organisms that are decomposers to make our soil, the bacteria and the funguses are a huge part of that. And then also we have our earthworms who crawl through the soil, and they make they crawl through the soil, they make little holes to aerate the soil, but they also turn some of that dead stuff into soil. They eat, specifically, the earthworms will eat the bacteria and funguses that are growing in the soil. So we're going to make a compost pen out of worms, and we're going to feed it some of our vegetable scraps, but they're actually eating the bacteria and funguses that occur when it breaks down and starts to decompose. And then crickets, which is a whole weird thing. Crickets are actually, they will dig into the soil and they will lay their eggs, and then the larvae live underground and they crawl out of the soil. So then, have you ever thought, where do the crickets go when it gets cold? They burrow back into the soil. Where are crickets during the day? Apparently they burrow back in the soil. So crickets are a really important piece of our soil food web, which is something we don't normally think about. So if we take care of our soil food web, then that actually helps us create a healthier soil underground. So we need compost for our gardens, for our plants. Where do we get compost? So you can go to Menards or Lowe's and you can buy compost. This is a 3 cubic foot bag, I believe, and it is $12.99 a bag. So 3 cubic feet isn't going to cover very much. So we can get kind of expensive, or we can make our own, which I highly recommend because it's kind of fun. So a traditional compost pile is just that. It can be a pile. You just pick a little space in your yard and start a pile. It's made up of fruit, vegetable trimmings, old plants in the garden, leaves, and grass clippings. The key to a compost pile is that you want to make sure that if you're throwing a lot of things that are going to decompose and turn into water, that you also have a lot of things in there that will absorb that water. So how many of you, actually I'm not going to make you admit this, but we've all done it, right? You've put that head of lettuce in the crisper drawer, and then you've forgotten about it, and then like 3 weeks later, it's this weird, gross water mess, because when fruits and vegetables decompose, they turn back into water. They're made up of so much water, so as they decompose, they just kind of release it all back out. So if we just put fruits and vegetables in our compost pile, that's a lot of water in there. So if we add in the other things, like the leaves from the trees, the grass clippings kind of fall in that fruits and vegetable category. But some shredded paper, cardboard to kind of help absorb some of that water too. It will help our compost pile decompose a little bit faster. When compost starts decomposing in the pile, it's that microscopic bacteria and funguses that help break everything down. And this will actually steam. Like it'll create enough energy inside there as it's breaking down that it will steam in the wintertime. And it's important that you turn your compost pile I turn mine about every 3 or 4 weeks, and honestly, I have chickens and they turn my compost for me a lot, just because they love some of the things I put in there. But compost piles, in the simplest form, is really just a pile. But you can get kind of fancy, and there's benefits to these fancier ones, right? This one is cinder block, and it has chicken wire screen on the top and on the bottom. You want to have a place where you either want the water to be able to get all the way in and then drain well, or not in at all. So that one would be beneficial. Like if I wanted to keep my chickens out of the compost, I'd probably do something a little bit more like that. They don't bother me at all, so I won't play in there. This one has those boards, and the idea there is that when you turn it, you would turn it into the other side, or that you would have an active side of your compost and an inactive side of your compost. And a lot of that is the idea of finishing your compost, because if you have it in a pile and you just keep adding to it and adding to it and adding to it, how do you get the compost out of it? So if you have a couple different sections of the compost pile, you can just kind of rotate through. This is the kind that we have at the Cope Environmental Center. It has screens on the side, it has boards on the front, it has a lid that flips up, and then it has a clear cover on the top that's a hard plastic. And that's to keep the critters out, it's to keep the rain out, but also the screen on the side promotes the airflow, because you want airflow into your compost pile. So we fill up the first bin, and when it's full, then we just let it sit. We do go out and turn it every so often, but for the most part, we let it sit, and then we fill up the second bin, and then we fill up the third bin. And then when we harvest our compost out of the first bin after about 6 to 8 months, the pieces that aren't composted, we throw into another section. I will also say that at the Cope Center, if you've been out there, we have the building that was on the first slide. It is a net zero energy, waste, and water building. So we have to be able to compost most of our materials that we use inside of there. So if you come out and you go to a wedding at the Cope Center, it's either has to use real china or compostable dinnerware, and all of that dinnerware can be composted in our bins. So sometimes we come across things that haven't quite gotten all the way composted that we're going to recompost in another section of the bin. Or we come across the plastic fork that somehow got in there and it's not composting anyway, and that we're just going to pick out and throw in the trash. This one is purely for decoration. I love that somebody got that creative for a compost pile. If I was that talented and had that much patience, I would totally do that just for fun. Except I would plant flowers in it. I don't know that I would compost it. These two are definitely beneficial. That black color, that key, will help promote the process of compost production, decomposition. The one that's on the roller, it simplifies turning, so you can just go out once a week and turn it. Most of those will compost the stuff that you put in 60 days. The challenge with that is that once you start turning it and making the compost, you can't really add more stuff to it. You have to let that finish off before you add more to it. This one, you add your compost to the top, and as it decomposes, the pieces of the compost fall to the bottom, and then the idea is that you can shovel out the compost from the bottom from that door down there. So I think all of them have their benefits. Certainly, if you Google or go to Pinterest, you can find all kinds of different compost piles, but the most important thing to remember is to keep your dairy out of it, and make sure that you add enough, I would say 1/3 fruits and vegetables to the 2/3 drier materials. So 1/3 wet, 2/3 dry. You can also be pretty cheap and easy with whatever you do. This can be chicken wire or hardware cloth, and just form it in a circle and wire it together, and then let it all compost. You can easily put that, like in the corner of your raised bed in the fall, you could just throw it in there, and then all winter throw your scraps in there, and then in the spring when you're ready to turn your soil before you plant, you can just stir all that in. And even if it does have a few of the bigger pieces in there, if you bury those deep enough in your raised beds, it wouldn't really make that big of a difference. The barrel, the trash barrel one, is a really, it's kind of like a take on the black ones that work really well, kind of a different method of composting on that. When I was first married and living in town, I had 3 of those, and you drill the holes down the side so they get plenty of air, drill some holes in the bottom so they get plenty of drainage, throw your compost in there, and when you want to turn it, you only fill it about 2/3 full. When you want to turn it, you bungee strap it down, turn it on its side, and then roll it across the yard. And that made it really simple to kind of keep it turned in. And mine wasn't blue, it was black, so that black color really helped get the compost to work pretty quick. We had 3 of them, so we were able to compost make a lot of compost when we were doing that. You also want to make sure, I guess I should mention this too, that you don't put any animal waste in it. Sometimes that's a no-brainer, but sometimes I think it's important to mention. We don't want to compost our kitty litter or our dog's waste or anything like that. So, do you guys have any questions on composting without worms?
What about like coffee grounds? Is that a good thing?
For sure. So coffee grounds, tea bags, banana peels, orange peels, eggshells. I compost a lot of my paper towels unless I'm using something on it that I don't want. Like right now, Lysol. So if I'm using anything like that, I don't compost it. But paper towels I throw in there a lot. I don't know. Sometimes you just kind of have to go with your gut, right? If it doesn't have anything that's going to smell when it decomposes, you can throw it in there. But if it's going to smell when it decomposes, keep it out. I will say that if you're going to go with that trash barrel method and you really wanted to compost your meat and your cheese and your dairy, you could do it in there. You just have to know it's going to smell. Mm-hmm. And then make sure you bungee it tight because the animals will try to get into it if they can smell it. You can, this is what I was going to say, you can compost breads as long as you don't put mayonnaise on them. You can compost pasta and marinara sauce, but not pasta and meatball sauce. So kind of think it through like that. Pasta is fine, breads are fine. I would keep out any breads that you have butter on. So no, like the fats and the oils would be bad for the composting.
I've heard that too much citrus, too many orange peels are problematic for some crops. Is there a healthy pH balance? Or do you have a rule of thumb for that? We just do what's in what we ate, and we're not selective at all.
So we don't eat a lot of citrus at our house.
Okay.
I have a child with citrus sensitivity, so we compost our orange peels. But if you were eating, I know those little clementines are like the thing with kids, right? If you're eating like 4 or 5 of those a day, I would just maybe 1 can go in there for a week. I mean, I wouldn't put a lot of citrus in there because you're right, there is that toxicity issue. And that's really more of an issue of the way it breaks down. You know how your citrus gets that weird blue-green mold on it when it decomposes? Mm-hmm. That is what's bad. It's the decomposition piece and not necessarily the citrus itself.
Is it bad for the worms or the seedlings?
It's just bad for the way that the citrus peel molds. It's too much of a mold load. So it's just too much for the system and throws the whole thing off balance. Because it's not a natural soil mold, it's a citrus related mold.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
My mother-in-law told me years ago ago that she had a lot of rose bushes, and she would crunch up eggshells and coffee grounds. Now, they didn't compost. Can you just work those into the soil, or does it need to be, I don't, I'm trying to remember from
Right.
ancient times, but.
The old wives know things.
Yeah.
So, the coffee grounds, you can throw right into your compost bin, and even the eggshells you can too. But I would crush them up a little bit more before you throw them in there.
But can they be worked into the soil without
Mm-hmm.
compost, without going, because they lived in Los Angeles, so there was no,
There was no composting.
there was no place to do it, but she would kind of nurture the plants
Mm-hmm.
that way.
So my mom does the same thing for her hydrangeas.
Okay?
She takes her coffee grounds and her eggshells and she puts them in this bowl until it gets so many in there, and then she just crushes them up, and then she takes them out and puts them around the roots of her hydrangeas.
Okay.
And she told me that that's how you get the purple hydrangeas. I don't know. Do you know? She has beautiful hydrangeas.
So it changes the soil pH somehow.
The coffee would. The eggshells are good for your garden because that's a huge source of calcium. And when you grow your tomatoes and you get blossom and rot, when your tomatoes start getting gross, that's a calcium deficiency. So if you crush up your eggshells and put those where you're going to plant your tomatoes, that'll help prevent blossom and rot. You can also use oyster shell, crushed up oyster shell, in your gardens to prevent that as well. But the key to that is you can't plant your tomato and then put your eggshell in there with it, like the Native Americans when they planted the dead fish with the corn, so you get beautiful corn. That worked for the corn, but the eggshells need more time to incorporate into the soil for that calcium to leach out. And the oyster shell too. So if you're going to do that, amend your soil to prevent blossom and rot, you need to do that 3 and 4 years in a row before you really see a highly successful tomato crop. But if you do start to see blossom and rot, make sure that you do start incorporating some of your calcium back into your soil. So we have vermicomposting, and vermicomposting is just another way to compost, only with worms. The end result is worm digestion and aerobic, which is decomposition with air, using worms and the other organism in there. And it's more nutrient-rich than normal compost because, honestly, it's just worm poop. So the worms are crawling through, they're creating their own manure, and they're creating a sort of compost. A healthy soil, if we went out and we dug a cubic foot of soil out of a cornfield, we would consider it healthy. The USDA would consider it healthy if it had 100 earthworms per square foot. So foot wide and a foot deep, 100 earthworms. So how many of you can go out to your raised bed area right now, and find 100 earthworms in a square foot? Not me. I just moved to my house 6 months ago, and there's raised beds in the backyard, but they don't really look like they've been amended lately, so I haven't been able to find any worms in them. And part of that could also be the chickens have eaten everything they could find back there too. So, but vermicomposting is kind of fun. It's a fun way to compost and kind of simple way to do it as well. To worm compost, you can use any of the 1,800 kinds of earthworms on the planet, but the red wigglers are the ones that are most commonly used for worm composting because they eat up to 50% of their body weight every day in food. So I have an 18-year-old boy, and I would argue he is 6 foot tall and 130 pounds, that he probably eats 50% of his body weight every day in food. Right before I came, I watched him eat a foot-long Subway cold cut combo, and then said, "Mom, I'm still hungry." So he ate 2 packages of Pop-Tarts and walked out the door carrying a bag of Doritos, and I'm guessing I'm never going to see that bag again. And that was just at 5 o'clock. So we all know I'm feeding him pizza at midnight. So he might actually eat half his body weight. But I certainly do not eat my body weight, half my body weight. If James was a worm, he would have to eat, what did I say? I'm going to say he weighs 120 pounds because the math is easier. He would have to eat 240 quarter pounders every single day, and then get up the next morning, like he'd have to eat 240 a day, get up tomorrow and eat 240 more to eat like a worm. So that's pretty amazing. Our worms will double in population in worm beds about once every 2 months. Worm beds are simple and easy to maintain because you can actually just leave them alone for a couple months, and the worms do really, really well when you neglect them. So I have here my traveling worm bin. If you come to the Cope Center, we have a big one that stays in the classroom, and it looks like a house, and it has the different layers of decomposition in it, and we keep it going year-round all the time. This is the one that goes to programs with me. So I'll carry it around so you can take a look at it. It started out as shredded paper, and right now it has tomato. It had some cherry tomatoes that went a little bit too far past their prime. So all the tomato seeds are sprouting inside my worm bed.
So do you use tomatoes and things like that have seeds in your compost as well?
Oh yeah.
Because they won't grow?
I mean, they'll grow. When you're composting it in the compost pile, they'll grow and sprout, but after you turn it, it kind of reincorporates it back in. Like here in a minute, I'm going to stir this up so you guys can see the worms. And all these tomatoes that have sprouted will just be mixed back into the soil and then compost as well.
So that's the point in turning it, so you don't get that, huh?
Yeah.
So where does one buy a red wiggles? Do you buy worms? Where do you get them to throw in your stuff?
To my worm bin? So,
I saw 50 on the street.
Can I take a picture?
oh yeah.
When it rains, yeah, when it rains, just go out when it's raining.
So,
Look, she's got.
I did. I stopped at, you know when you go drive down the road and the gas station says Wolves Crawlers? The 30 worms are the red wigglers. So they have the big night, like the package of 15 night crawlers, or they have the 30 smaller worms. These are the red wigglers here. So this is like $4 for one of these. But if you're gonna start a worm bin, like this is the perfect amount of worms for this size of worm bin. But you can take this and make this into a regular Rubbermaid tote, regular sized Rubbermaid tote. And if you're gonna do that, I would just, there's a place on the internet called Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, and they sell a pound of red wigglers, and there's about 1,000 worms in a pound. And it's about $18 for a pound of red wigglers. Sometimes they run specials where you can buy a pound, get a pound free. But I would get it from there. They sell really nice worms. And their worms have a good survival rate, and they eat really, really well. I got these at Gilman's in Centerville. And the guy, when I pulled them out of the fridge, he was like, "Oh wow, we still have those in there? You know, the worm man hasn't been here since last October." So of course I ripped it open to make sure they were still alive, and they were. Which goes to show they benefit from neglect, because apparently these guys haven't been taken care of since October.
My gosh.
I know, but they're doing well here.
Much of the rest was right.
So, well, here we go. There's some eggshells. Have some eggshells in here. Tomato seeds.
Oh my gosh.
And right here.
Oh, there we go. Oh,
We have our worm.
Yeah, you do.
So this is like almost like your everyday worm. These worms are super excited to live in the worm bin because it's a controlled environment. They don't have to worry about predators or anything else. They're protected by the elements. That actually fits underneath my sink in my kitchen. So when I have just a few scraps, I can just throw them in there, as opposed to taking them out to the compost pile. When you guys look at this worm, there's a thicker part here in the center. That band is where the worms will share their love, right? Our worms are female and male at the same time, and they will mate and lay eggs, and each worm shares sperm and eggs with the other worm, which means that if you have two worms and they both lay eggs, you can have 6 worms in a matter of like 6 weeks. So they're very prolific. The reason that they're both male and female is that if you are blind and crawling through the soil, because our worm is blind, it will just happen upon another worm. It doesn't actually find a worm intentionally with its eyesight, and so then they both lay eggs. There you go. Worm biology. Important to know because kids will ask you, and if you have kids at home digging your worm bin, you'll have to be able to answer the question. So I'm going to see if I can find an egg in here, a worm egg. Which I did. And inside each one of these this is a little worm cocoon, is 3 to 6 baby earthworms. And when they're hatched out of the cocoon, they look just like adult earthworms, only they're just teeny tiny. So I show this to people so that if they find these in their worm bin, they're not like, I didn't put that in there, I don't know what that is, this is just a worm egg.
Looks like a seed.
It really does. The worms can lay an egg once every 3 days.
I'm buying my compost in a bag.
Can you show it here?
Yeah.
Looks like caviar.
There we
Or
go.
seed, yeah.
Little tiny seed.
Thank you.
So one of the challenges with this bin at the bottom is pretty wet because remember I said the byproduct of compost is water. So it actually needs, it sounds a little goopy. It needs a little bit more paper mixed into it, which I'll probably do that tomorrow back at the Cope Center. But the reason why is that if we have too much water in our worm bin, we move from aerobic, which is decomposition with air, to anaerobic, which is decomposition without air. And when we go to the anaerobic piece, then we have odor issues. And we don't want odor issues, we want our worm bin to not smell. So if you have too much water, you just add more shredded paper and go from there. This used to be, when it was started in October was when I put this one together. It was all the shredded paper right here. So all of the brown soil-like stuff that you see in here is all what the worms have produced since October. So the do's and don'ts for a healthy worm bin, we're feeding it our compost and kitchen scraps. So in small quantities, it says right up there at top, Beth, citrus, onions, garlic, cereals, breads, and pasta. So don't overload it with those kind of things. But do make sure you feed it most of your vegetable waste, fruit waste, eggshells, tea bags, coffee grounds, cocoa core, newsprint, leaves, paper. Any finished compost. I don't know why you would add compost to your worm compost, but maybe. Make sure you don't feed it anything that is oily or greasy. So no French fries from McDonald's, even though those are potatoes. Those are fried foods, so leave everything that's fried out. Human or pet waste, leave that out. Non-degradable items. I do throw things in my worm bin that are not biodegradable, but only for educational purposes. so that kids understand that if we throw like a bottle of glue in there, that it's never going to decompose, that the plastic will stay. Don't throw anything in there with pesticides or herbicides, no meat, bones, or fat, or poisonous plants. So as long as it's all something that you would eat, you can probably feed it to your worms. So sometimes people ask me, Stephanie, after I've spent all this time composting with worms, how do I get my worm compost out? So the simple answer to that is worms don't like light. So I can take all of this and pour it out onto like a plastic tarp and section it off into smaller pieces, and the worms will crawl to the bottom of the pile, and you can literally just flip the compost right off of it. Like take the top layer of compost off, the worms will stay on the bottom. So you have to spread it out though. One of the worm bins that I use at home is a Worm Factory 360, and it has 4 different trays, and the trays all have holes on the bottom. So I'm only emptying 1 tray at a time before I add more stuff to the top tray. On that one, I just take the heat lamp from the chickens and stick it on top of the worm bin for about 20 minutes, and that light and the heat lamp draws the worms deeper into the soil, so they crawl into the layer below it, and then that just makes it really easy to take the tray off and harvest the worms that way. The worm bin that we're going to make here in a few minutes is a lot like this one, but we're going to stick a extra little container here. And if we were going to harvest the worms out of this one, this is to collect water, because the water from the worm bin is called compost tea, and it's really, really nutritious for your plants. But if we empty the water out of this, then put your worm bin on top, and then shine the light on top, the worms will crawl out the bottom, and then you can harvest your compost that way. So, once you harvest your compost, you can mix it with potting soil at a 1:5 ratio, so that you can have beautiful house plants, beautiful flowers, those kind of things. So for those of us who are not good at math, when I say a 1:5 ratio, that means 1 part compost to 4 cups potting soil. So you have 5 cups total, but one bit of it is compost. So yeah, you can use it for garden bread, starting seeds, house plants, whatever you want to grow something in. You can use your worm compost for that. All right, so you guys ready? Beth's like, let's do it. So pre-COVID, I would have you guys come up and help, but I don't really want to do too much cross-contamination. We have our dollar store finds here, right? So we have just a simple container with a lid that latches. I have my favorite drill. I'm going to drill some holes in the bottom. My drill bit is a little bit bigger than what I think a worm is going to be, so that the worms can crawl through. Actually, we'll do it this way. So I'm going to drill maybe 7 or 8 holes. If you're stressed out, drilling holes is a great stress reliever. We're going to put some around the top. Beth, I'll vacuum for you in a bit. And we'll stick it right on top there. We have some water here. Beth's like, I'm not worried about the plastic on the floor, but a bucket of water in Stephanie McCurdy feels like danger. idea is that your paper gets damp, but it's not, like super mushy. Like all that paper is just crushing down.
You said earlier that the worms don't eat the vegetables and fruits, they eat the bacteria that comes off the fruit vegetables, is that what you said?
Mhm.
And do they do the same with paper bacteria?
So,
Is it decomposes or no?
so think about this like corn, right? We eat corn, and our body processes what's inside the corn kernel,
Sure.
but when we use the bathroom, we find the corn
Right.
in the, so the worms will eat the paper, and they'll eat the compost, but what they're digesting out of it
What's feeding them?
is the bacteria. Does that help
Yes,
clarify
that's
that?
super helpful, thank you.
Yes. Then we're just gonna squeeze some of the extra water out of here. Our worms are like 90% water, so. Then spread it out. Super simple, right? You guys can all do this so far. And then we have our worms from Gilman's Home Improvement. They're gonna be so excited here in a minute. They're like food! It says there's 30 of them in here. I'm not gonna count them, I'm just gonna go by faith. But I usually just pour. Oh wow, that was actually kind of cool.
Nest.
Yeah.
Look at them. There they are.
2 of them just escaped. But I'll pour the soil in there because the worms don't have teeth. They have gizzards like chickens. And when they are crawling through the soil, the gizzards have to rub together to help them chew up their food. So they need a little bit of grit in the worm bin, which they eventually get from the fruits and vegetables that we put in there, and some of the other things too. But to start out with, if you're starting a new worm bin, I just leave them in the soil that they came with in the worm bin, but also if you have any like play sand or anything like that that you can throw in there, that's always good for them too. They also, the finer you crush your eggshells when you put the eggshells in the worm bin, they'll use that as well. They are already, because they don't like light, making their way towards the bottom of the worm bin. So, I brought with me some compost. Well, not compost, some things to compost. I have some kiwi, so a little bit of onion and some purple cabbage. So we'll bury that in here too. It's kind of a lot in one corner.
Are you burying it because the worms are gonna be happier underneath, or because it decomposes better, or both?
It's actually a whole lot of reasons.
Oh,
Burying it because the worms are underneath, so they're more likely to find it. But the onions smell like onions, and as they decompose, have you ever left an onion sitting on the counter?
sure, right.
It starts to have that onion smell. We cover it, it doesn't smell. And then thirdly, we want to make sure that we don't get fruit flies, and if we have it covered over the top, then we don't get the fruit flies. If you're doing a worm bin, I'm going to carry this around because my worms are pretty much all crawling under the paper now. I can disrupt them with my finger. If you do get fruit flies, take some cardboard and make it fit the top, cut it to fit the top, get it wet, and then cover the whole thing. And then put the lid on it and let it sit for a week or two, and the fruit flies won't be able to get to the compost, so they won't come. they won't come disrupt your space anymore. If you have any composting questions, whether it's a worm bin or otherwise, you can always call me. So, now if I probably do this before I leave, but add a little bit more paper on top, because it does settle, and the more space, the more paper they have in there, the happier that they are. So,
Oh, hello. Wow. They do look happier.
yes, they've been living for apparently 6 months in this little tiny container. So they will like self-regulate their population as well. Because there wasn't enough food or space in here, they didn't really reproduce inside this container, but when they get bigger spaces, they do much better. So people ask me, will they crawl out of the holes, right? Is anybody thinking that? Well, if I keep it under my sink, is it gonna crawl out? And never have I had worms crawling out of any of the worm bins that I've had. When I first moved home from college, 20-some years ago, moved back home with my parents like most college kids did, and my mom was not at all happy to see me. She always wanted, she will tell you this to your face, she will say, I always wanted a little girl that could dress up in pretty little dresses and take to tea parties who would be a girl, but I got this. I graduated with a degree in forestry and wildlife resources. I took classes on how to climb trees. I was a whitewater rafting guide in my youth, completely tomboyish, completely outside, always covered in dirt and mud, always doing something she didn't want me to be doing. And I moved home from college while she's at work, of course, because I can't do it when she's home, she'll yell. And I rearranged her total dining room that had the white carpeting. I had all these frogs that I was raising for the Department of Natural Resources on this frog project that I was working on. So I had like, I don't know, 2,000 tadpoles that I arranged in the containers on top of her dining room table. And then I moved my worms to the basement. So she got home from work and she was clearly unhappy about the frogs, but she lived with it. She was okay until some of them started escaping. You have that. But I had been there for probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, and I was working at the Cope Center, and went downstairs to get something out of the dryer because I was waiting tables on the side. Went down there, and the dryer was still going, and there was just a few more minutes, and I was eating a banana, and I was talking to her, and I opened up the worm bin, stirred it with a wooden spoon, and threw my banana peel in there, and then closed it, and didn't think anything about it because I'd been there for a while. And she looks at me, and she was like, what did you just do? And then it was the whole thing. Stephanie Michelle, you've had worms in my house this whole time. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do with you? You have to move out. The frogs were too much. The worms are not okay. Like, but they've been here for 6 months and you didn't even notice. What about the dog? So now she has one of a whole, she started her own worm bin. She keeps it going in her basement. She's happy as can be. But those worms were in her basement forever and she didn't know they were there. Never crawled out, no idea that they were there. She said, I wonder why there was holes in the container, but I didn't think it was any big deal. Now she's not very trustworthy or trusting of me, so.
What temperature does that need to stay within?
Above freezing. Typically, worms love 50 degrees and warmer. They can survive. Even if this was, like tonight, it would probably be fine if I left it outside. They'd probably be okay. But if it was gonna be freezing multiple nights in a row, you'd have to move it someplace where it wasn't freezing.
So it's not the kind of thing that you typically have outside?
If you're gonna have it outside, so if you're gonna have it outside, I would put it in something that you could put some straw bales around in the dead of winter.
Yeah.
Oh, or just know that if you made a worm bin, that if you're gonna leave it outside all winter, that you're probably gonna add some more worms to it in the spring.
Yeah.
And that might just be where you are. You stir it up and has worms in it, great. If it doesn't, you know, you need to add more worms in the spring.
If it were outside, would the possums and the coons get into it? I mean, if the lid was where they, well, they'll get into almost anything.
They will get it. It's a hard question to answer. So the worm composter that I have with the layers, the 361, we keep it outside, but we keep a bungee strap over the top of it so that they can't get into it. And honestly, that one, we had trouble with ants last year. So we ended up having to put the feet of it into, we took Folgers coffee, those plastic Folger coffee things, and filled them with water, and then stuck the feet of the composter down into it, because it sits off the ground about this far. And the ants won't climb into it, because they can't climb up the legs of it anymore, because they have to swim across the water, they won't do it. So. Any other questions? I'll put my contact up there, so if you need to email me or call me for any reason, you certainly can. You can also send me pictures of your beautiful vegetables and flowers and fruits if you compost and are successful. I will celebrate your successes with you. If you come out to the Cope Center and want to go on a hike, I will hike with you or send you on your way if I can't get away from my office for a hike that day.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank
Really
you. Thank you.
appreciate it. Now we're all ready to go back and get some worm bins going. Whoa.
Do some composting.
So thank you all for coming, and I know you've got your forms that you just filled out. Get some seeds if you'd like, and you can keep your forms on the table, or you can turn them in to my chair, and then pick up your chocolate on your way out. Thank you so much, and please note the upcoming sessions. April 8th is our next session, is dealing with pests and disease. Yes, so I think that one just sold out, but we do have a waiting list, and I called the waiting list tonight because we had cancellation. So thank you all for coming, and thank you so much again.
You're welcome.
I've got a small token of thanks for you. One of my favorite dairy-free chocolates,
Too good to me.
and hyacinths that you will bring into life.
I really love it. I love it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm excited about the chocolate.